Have you ever noticed that there's a brutal difference between the man who runs, who vanishes without explanation, who leaves you in a deafening emotional void, and that man who has the absolute certainty that you're the one he wants to be with for the rest of his life? There's a moment in the twin flame journey that's almost imperceptible to those looking in from the outside, but absolutely unmistakable for those living this experience. It's the final phase, that turning point where everything shifts, where the divine masculine you once knew goes through a metamorphosis so profound that he becomes almost unrecognizable. And the question that's probably hammering in your head right now is, how do I know if he's truly entered this final phase or if this is just another variation of the same old cycle? How do I tell the difference between genuine transformation and just another temporary performance that'll crumble at the first sign of trouble? The answer lies in the details of behavior, in the subtleties of change. Because when the divine masculine truly enters the final phase, when he finally looks into the mirror you represent and doesn't look away anymore, when he stops running from his own internal demons and sits in the terrifying silence of his own company, everything changes. The first thing you'll notice, and this might seem contradictory at first, is that he's going to go quiet. But it's not that cowardly silence you already know. It's not the emotional ghosting that left you days or weeks without a response while you consumed yourself analyzing, trying to understand what happened, what you did wrong, why he disappeared again. This is a completely different silence, and the difference is in its energetic quality. When he was running, his silence was cold, empty, loaded with unspoken rejection. You could feel him avoiding you, building walls. Each day of silence another confirmation that you weren't important enough to deserve an explanation. But the silence of the final phase is different. It's a warm silence, if that even makes sense. You can feel that he's present even in the physical absence. You can sense that he's not ignoring you. He's finally paying attention to himself. And as much as that might still hurt, as much as you'd still prefer his physical presence, there's a quality to this silence that doesn't leave you with that feeling of desperate abandonment. It's like you know, on some deep level, that he's doing the inner work he needs to do, that he's finally stopped running and is facing everything he's avoided his entire life. Analytical psychology calls this shadow integration, this process of confronting all the parts of yourself that were repressed, denied, hidden in the depths of the unconscious. And this process can't happen while he's trying to maintain an external connection, while he's performing, while he's using relationships as a distraction from himself. When the divine masculine is in the final phase, you'll notice he stops reacting. This is huge, and you need to pay attention to this because it's one of the clearest indicators of genuine transformation. In the previous phases, he was completely reactive. You'd say something and he'd explode in defensive rage, or he'd shut down completely and disappear for days. He was constantly in fight-or-flight mode, interpreting anything you said as an attack, a demand, an attempt to control him. His wound was so exposed, so raw, that he couldn't have a difficult conversation without all his defense mechanisms immediately kicking in. But in the final phase, something shifts. He develops this capacity to listen without immediately defending himself, to receive criticism without interpreting it as an attack on his existence, to sit with the discomfort of a difficult conversation without needing to run or strike back. This doesn't mean he agrees with everything you say. It doesn't mean he becomes an emotional doormat who just accepts anything. It means he finally has enough internal space to process things before reacting, to distinguish between what's really about him and what's the other person's own stuff. He's developed what psychology calls the observer function, this ability to witness his own emotional reactions without being completely hijacked by them. Another change you'll notice is how he talks about himself. In the previous phases, he was either in total denial mode, pretending everything was fine, that he had it all under control, that there was nothing to process or heal, or he was in victim mode, blaming everyone and everything for his circumstances, his behaviors, his choices. He blamed you for being too intense, for having too many expectations, for pushing too hard. He blamed his parents for the difficult childhood, blamed ex-partners for relationship trauma, blamed work for the stress, blamed the universe for bad luck. There was always an external culprit, always a justification that exempted him from responsibility. But in the final phase, you're going to hear something completely different. You'll hear him taking genuine responsibility. Not that performative responsibility, where he positions himself as the villain of the story to manipulate your compassion, but a mature responsibility, where he honestly recognizes his own destructive patterns, his own unhealed wounds, his own defense mechanisms that hurt people around him. He'll talk about himself with a blend of compassion and honesty that's very different from both arrogance and self-deprecation. He'll be able to say things like, "I realized my emotional coldness wasn't strength. It was fear. I understood that my need for control came from a deep terror of vulnerability. I recognized that I hurt you because I didn't know how to handle how important you were." You'll also notice a drastic change in how he relates to time and urgency. In the previous phases, he lived in extremes. Either he was completely obsessed, seeking you out with an almost desperate intensity, wanting immediate answers, wanting to define the relationship, wanting guarantees, or he was completely distant, saying he needed time, that he wasn't ready, that you needed to take it slow. He oscillated between these two poles without ever finding a center. But in the final phase, he stops being in a rush and stops using slowness as a form of avoidance. He develops this rhythm of his own that's neither anxious urgency nor evasive procrastination. If he pulls back, he's able to communicate that with clarity and gentleness instead of just disappearing. If he moves closer, he does it consistently instead of that volcanic intensity that always precedes the next flight. He understands that there are processes that can't be rushed, that true psychological integration takes time, that there's no point forcing a maturation that hasn't happened internally yet. And he stops pressuring you to make decisions before you're ready, stops demanding certainties that nobody can give, stops requiring that you wait for him while he offers nothing but empty words and future promises. The way the divine masculine relates to his own vulnerability in the final phase is profoundly different. His whole life, vulnerability was interpreted as weakness. He was conditioned to believe that a real man doesn't cry, doesn't ask for help, doesn't admit he's afraid or doesn't know what to do. So he built layer upon layer of emotional armor. He developed a persona of strength that was actually a prison. And when you showed up in his life with your capacity to feel deeply, to express emotions without filters, to be vulnerable without shame, it simultaneously fascinated and terrified him. You were a mirror of what he'd repressed in himself. And in the previous phases, he reacted to that by criticizing you, calling you too sensitive, too dramatic, too intense, when really he was judging in you what he couldn't accept in himself. But in the final phase, this dynamic completely changes. He starts developing a healthy relationship with his own vulnerability. He allows himself to cry, and it's not those strategic tears. It's a deep crying that comes from a place he didn't even know existed inside him. He allows himself to admit when he doesn't know, when he's scared, when he needs support. He stops having to perform strength constantly. And paradoxically, it's precisely when he allows himself to be vulnerable that he finally becomes truly strong. Because real strength isn't rigidity. It's flexibility. It's the capacity to bend without breaking, to feel without falling apart. One of the most beautiful and hardest to perceive changes is his relationship with solitude. Pay attention to this because it's fundamental. In the previous phases, he couldn't be alone. He always needed some distraction, some project, some relationship, something to fill the internal void that terrified him. He jumped from one relationship to another without ever taking time to process, to heal, to truly be with himself. Or at the other extreme, he stayed alone but was constantly consumed by loneliness, by that painful feeling of incompleteness that made him desperately search for someone to fill that void. But in the final phase, he finally learns the difference between being alone and being lonely. He develops this capacity to be in his own company and find there not an emotional wasteland, but a fertile space of self-knowledge, creativity, and peace. He stops outsourcing his own happiness. He stops needing constant external validation to feel valuable. He becomes the friend he always looked for in others, the father he wished he'd had, the companion he desired to find. And this completely changes the dynamic of the twin flame connection. Because he's no longer seeking you out to fill a void. He's coming from a place of wholeness, and you can feel that difference. When he was coming from lack, there was a quality of desperation in his energy, a neediness that was almost suffocating. But when he comes from wholeness, the energy is completely different. It's light, it's abundant. It's an invitation rather than a demand. You'll also notice a profound transformation in how he sees you. In the previous phases, he saw you through so many layers of projection that he could barely see you for real. He projected onto you the mother who didn't nurture him adequately, the goddess he idealized, the threat that could swallow his individuality, the savior who would pull him out of his own darkness. You were never just you. You were always a symbol of something bigger, an archetype, a projection of his internal world. And that was exhausting, wasn't it? Because you couldn't be yourself. You were constantly dealing with these projections, trying to prove you weren't the witch he feared you'd be, or trying to live up to the impossible goddess he'd created in his mind. But in the final phase, the projections start falling away. He can finally see you as you really are, a flesh and blood woman, with light and shadow, with good days and bad days, with strengths and weaknesses, with your own journey that doesn't revolve around him. He stops putting you on a pedestal and stops throwing you in the mud. He can see you in the full complexity of who you are. And this is liberating for both of you, because finally there can be a genuine meeting between two real people instead of a meeting between projections and fantasies. The way he handles anger also changes drastically. In the previous phases, his anger was destructive and uncontrolled. Either he exploded in verbal attacks that left you emotionally devastated, saying cruel things in the heat of the moment, using your vulnerabilities against you as weapons, or he completely repressed the anger and it leaked out in passive-aggressive ways, through punitive silences, cutting sarcasm, subtle sabotage of the relationship. He'd never learned to have a healthy relationship with his own anger because anger was interpreted as either something that needs to be immediately dumped on others or something that needs to be completely suppressed because civilized men don't allow themselves to feel anger. But in the final phase, he learns that anger is just an emotion. It's not good or bad. It's just information about boundaries that were crossed, needs that aren't being met, values that are being violated. He learns to feel anger without acting destructively from it. He can say, "I'm angry right now and I need time to process this before we talk," instead of either exploding or vanishing. He can use the energy of anger constructively to establish healthy boundaries, to defend his values, to make necessary changes in his life. Anger stops being this destructive force and becomes an ally in the process of individuation. When the divine masculine is in the final phase, you'll notice he stops competing with you. This might seem strange, but pay attention to how many times in the previous phases he needed to prove he was smarter, more spiritual, more evolved, more conscious than you. Whenever you shared an insight, he had to invalidate it or present a better insight. Whenever you were vulnerable, he had to minimize your feelings or make it seem like you were overreacting. Whenever you were strong, he somehow had to put you back in an inferior position. This came from deep insecurity, from a need to maintain a hierarchy where he was above and you were below. Because deep down he feared that if you were truly equals, if you could really be as strong as him, then he wouldn't be necessary, wouldn't be important, wouldn't have value. But in the final phase, this dynamic dies. He stops needing to be superior. He can celebrate your strength without feeling threatened by it. He can admit when you're right and he's wrong without it destroying his ego. He can learn from you without feeling like it diminishes him. He finally understands that true partnership isn't a hierarchy. It's a dance between equals who are each on their own journey of becoming whole. His relationship with truth also transforms radically. In the previous phases, he lied. Maybe not obvious, blatant lies, but those subtle lies. Lies of omission, half-truths, distortions of reality designed to confuse you, to protect his ego, to avoid conflict. He said he was fine when he was falling apart inside. He said he wasn't seeing anyone when he was in other relationships. He said he loved you while all his actions said otherwise. And when you confronted these inconsistencies, he made you question your own perception, made you feel like you were crazy, overreacting, paranoid. That left you constantly off balance, constantly doubting yourself, constantly trying to decode what was real and what was illusion. But in the final phase, he develops deep integrity. He stops lying, to himself and to you. He tells the truth even when the truth is uncomfortable, even when the truth might hurt you, even when the truth doesn't cast him in a favorable light. And this isn't cruelty. It's respect. It's treating you like an adult human being who can handle reality, instead of a child who needs to be protected with comfortable lies. This honesty can be painful sometimes, but it's infinitely better than living in a world of illusions and distortions. You'll also notice he stops using spirituality as escapism. In the previous phases, he maybe dove into spiritual concepts in a way that was clearly a flight from material and psychological reality. He talked about high vibration while treating people around him with disrespect. He talked about detachment while using it as an excuse for emotional unavailability. He talked about the flow of the universe while using it as justification for not taking any concrete action in his life. He used the idea of twin flames as validation of dysfunctional behaviors. as if the intensity of the connection justified any kind of treatment. But in the final phase, his spirituality becomes embodied, practical, lived in the everyday. He understands that there's no point meditating 3 hours a day if you're a jerk to the people you claim to love. He understands that true spiritual evolution isn't about having transcendent experiences. It's about how you treat the waiter at the restaurant, how you speak to your mother, how you honor your commitments, how you handle everyday frustrations. He stops using the spiritual journey as a way to avoid the deep psychological work that needs to be done. He integrates spirit and matter, transcendence and immanence, the divine and the human. A crucial change you'll notice is his capacity to sustain consistency. In the previous phases, he was like an emotional yo-yo. One day he was completely present, showering you with attention and affection, making you feel like you were finally getting somewhere, and the next day he'd disappear completely, cold and distant, as if nothing had happened between you. You lived on an emotional roller coaster, never knowing which version of him you'd encounter, never able to trust because the pattern was always the same. Intense approach, followed by abrupt flight. And that left you constantly in a state of hypervigilance, constantly analyzing every word, every gesture, trying to predict when the next flight would be, trying to protect yourself from the next rejection. But in the final phase, he develops consistency. His actions start aligning with his words. He doesn't make promises he can't keep. He doesn't create expectations he doesn't intend to honor. If he says he's going to do something, he does it. If he says he feels something, his behavior reflects it. And this consistency finally allows you to start relaxing, trusting, lowering your own defenses. You're no longer waiting for the next betrayal, the next disappointment, the next time the rug gets pulled out from under your feet. The divine masculine in the final phase also develops a capacity to genuinely listen. This sounds simple, but it's revolutionary. In the previous phases, when you tried to express your feelings, he either got defensive immediately, or tried to fix the problem before really hearing what you were saying, or interrupted you to explain his perspective, or just emotionally checked out and waited for you to finish talking so he could leave. He never really listened. He was always thinking about the next thing he was going to say, always preparing his defense, always trying to find a way to end the conversation as quickly as possible. But in the final phase, he learns to just listen. He can be present with your feelings without trying to change them, fix them, or convince you that you shouldn't be feeling what you're feeling. He can validate your experience even when it's different from his. He can say things like, "I understand you feel that way. Tell me more about it," instead of, "You shouldn't feel that way. You're overreacting. You're misinterpreting." This kind of listening is deeply healing, because for the first time, you feel truly seen, truly heard, truly received in your emotional totality. You'll also notice he stops making you the center of his existence or excluding you completely from his life. In the previous phases, he oscillated between these two extremes. Either you were everything, and he dropped all his goals, his friends, his interests to focus only on you, creating a suffocating and unsustainable dynamic. Or he excluded you totally, keeping you in a separate compartment of his life where you never met his friends, were never included in his plans, were never considered in his important decisions. But in the final phase, he finds balance. He has his own life, his own interests, his own goals, and he also creates genuine space for you in that life. You're not his whole life, but you're also not a footnote. You're an important part of a life he's consciously building. He includes you in his future plans naturally, not as a vague promise of some distant day, but as a present reality. He introduces you to the important people in his life because he's no longer hiding the connection, no longer keeping you as a secret, no longer ashamed or afraid of what others will think. The way he handles conflict also completely changes. In the previous phases, conflict meant the end. The first disagreement, the first tension, the first moment where you weren't in perfect harmony, and he'd run. He didn't have the capacity to navigate conflicts in a healthy way because in his world, conflict meant danger, meant the relationship was failing, meant you weren't compatible, meant any excuse that justified his flight. But in the final phase, he understands that conflict is natural, that two people with their own histories, needs, and perspectives are inevitably going to have moments of friction, and that this isn't a sign of failure, it's an opportunity for growth, for deeper understanding, for real intimacy that can only exist when you can get through difficult moments together. He stops running at the first sign of trouble. He stays. He has difficult conversations. He disagrees with you respectfully instead of attacking or shutting down. He can repair after a conflict instead of leaving wounds open and bleeding indefinitely. He learns that real relationships aren't about never having problems. They're about having the capacity to work through problems together. One of the most important things you need to understand is that when the divine masculine is in the final phase, he stops seeing you as responsible for his healing. In the previous phases, there was this implicit or explicit expectation that you were the key to his wholeness, that your love would heal him, that your patience would transform him, that your devotion would awaken him. And that put impossible pressure on you, because you felt responsible for his journey. You felt that if you just loved more, waited more, were more patient, more understanding, more perfect, then he'd finally heal, and you could have the relationship you knew was possible. But in the final phase, he takes total responsibility for his own healing. He doesn't expect you to save him. He doesn't blame you when he's triggered. He doesn't make you his therapist. He seeks professional help if needed. He does his own inner work. He takes responsibility for his own process. And that frees you from a burden that was never yours to carry. You can finally just be yourself in the connection instead of being the savior, the therapist, the mother, all those roles you should never have had to play. The divine masculine in the final phase also develops a healthy relationship with his own masculinity. He stops confusing masculinity with domination, with control, with emotional coldness, with all those toxic stereotypes that society tries to impose. He starts understanding that true masculinity is about conscious presence. It's about responsibility without control. It's about protection without possessiveness. It's about strength that doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. He integrates what analytical psychology calls the anima, that feminine dimension of the psyche that every human being possesses regardless of physical gender. He stops rejecting sensitive, intuitive, emotional aspects of himself as being too feminine or as threats to his masculinity. He becomes a complete human being who honors both the masculine and feminine within himself. And this reflects in how he relates to you, because he no longer needs to diminish you to feel man enough. He no longer needs to control you to feel strong. He no longer needs to make you small so he can feel big. Perhaps one of the most subtle but profound changes is in the quality of his presence. Even when you're not in physical contact, even when there's geographic distance, even when you're in periods of separation, you can feel that he's present in a way that's hard to explain, but impossible to ignore. It's not that he's energetically stalking you. It's not that he's constantly trying to maintain contact. It's more subtle than that. It's like his presence has become more solid, more grounded, and you can feel it. You stop having that feeling of holding on to something that's constantly slipping through your fingers. You stop feeling like you need to grip on with all your strength because at any moment he might disappear. There's a solidity, a reliability in his energy that allows you to relax. And this has nothing to do with him making promises or dramatic declarations of eternal love. It has to do with the quality of his being, with the level of integration he's reached. But here's the most important thing you need to understand about the divine masculine in the final phase. You can't wait for this. You can't put your life on pause hoping he'll finally reach this integration. You can't sacrifice yourself, diminish yourself, lose yourself in the hope that one day he'll wake up transformed and ready for union. Because the deepest truth about the twin flame journey is that it was never really about the other person. It was always about you. He's a mirror, a catalyst, a reflection of everything you need to integrate in yourself. All these qualities you're hoping to see in him, all these changes you want him to make, are actually invitations for you to develop those same qualities in yourself. The capacity to be alone without loneliness, to love without attachment, to have healthy boundaries, to be vulnerable without losing yourself, to take responsibility for your own healing, to develop consistency, to integrate light and shadow. All of this isn't about waiting for him to transform so you can then be happy. It's about you doing this work in yourself, about you becoming the complete and integrated person you came to be in this life. And here's the most beautiful and most cruel paradox of the twin flame journey. It's only when you stop waiting for him, when you stop placing your wholeness in his hands, when you finally become whole by yourself, that true union becomes possible. Because real union doesn't happen between two halves desperately searching for completion in each other. It happens between two whole beings who choose to walk side by side, not because they need to, but because they want to. Not to fill voids, but to share fullness. If this video resonated with you, if you're on this journey trying to understand what's happening, leave in the comments which part touched your heart the most. And subscribe to the channel because we're going to keep exploring these deep dimensions of the human psyche, these transformation journeys that bring us back home, inside ourselves.